morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the delegates who have dialed to a lot of interaction and questions. Please do feel free to interrupt me, and just Carla, feel free to pose those questions as they come in. I think the interaction will be great. So why the role of the executive in ERP failure? You know, Carla, one often, having been in this industry for many years, and dare I say decades, one often has the blame for ERP failures, and we can kind of unpack what failure means a little bit later. But the blame's often laid either at the feet of the SI, the systems integrator or partners, or very often the solution isn't. And I do think that it's time we shift that conversation a little bit. We have to look at the role of the client executive in that failure. At the end of the day, as Eric has very elegantly articulated, the responsibility for success benefits does sit with the executive. So I just wanted I thought it would be useful to a bit of a deep dive on that. And I do hope there are some executives who are listening, and I'd welcome their questions. So I'd like to touch on 5 specific points. Let me unpack this graph a little bit. On the vertical axis, company or organizational performance, however we can, and on the bottom axis, time. And if we look at two through the one or the other, there's going to be a high road to success, and there's going to be a low road to failure. It takes. I think that's the first important point to acknowledge. And there's no reason why we cannot have a very clear indication of these different phases. There's no reason why we.
Yeah, sorry, Clifford, I'm just going to jump in. You're coming in and out a little bit choppy. So I just want to let everyone know that I am monitoring your questions as well. So it's not the stream, just that connectivity. So continue to put your questions in the chat. Even if Clifford is a bit choppy on that side, we're just kind of working out the kinks.
Essentially, we do operate in an industry that is focused on implementation. And now I just want to talk to what we consider to be 3 critical phases in terms of that road to that ERP life cycle. Absolutely, the implementation is essential, but it really is just the enabling platform that we're putting in place at this stage. And too often, we have that premature declaration of victory at the point of go live, and the very effective project governance and oversight and structures and capabilities that we've put in place dissipates, and things start to unravel a little bit as per that low road, and we fall into that valley of despair. And of course, the depth and breadth of that valley of despair is going to vary depending on how far on that low road to failure we are. So it's absolutely essential that we keep the project on the high road, and even with the best will in the world, there is going to be some disruption to business go live. Even if we do manage to stay on the high road to success, and we avoid these common pitfalls, those 5 pitfalls that are defined on the low road to failure, even if we do avoid them, there's going to be some disruption. We are going, to some extent, we are going to the valley of despair, but hopefully it is short-lived, and we are quickly able to come out of it. And I think from a governance and tracking perspective, we're able to quickly come out of it and track the extent and understand whether we are on an upward curve on the way to that 3rd phase of optimization. So I think that's the first thing that we need to recognize. Your digital transformation or ERP program is going to follow one of these 2 roads to some extent. And very important that we understand on which route, on which road we are at any point in time, and very important to understand when we are moving from stabilization to optimization, because one cannot jump from implementation to optimization without stabilizing the solution first. We cannot achieve benefit of an unstable platform. So it's fundamentally important that we're able to track this journey and understand which road we're on. So I did want to just explain that the ERP lifecycle before we can actually understand what the executive's role is in ensuring that we stay on the high road and avoid the low road, and that, and most importantly, that we avoid or we spend as little time as possible in that valley of despair. Great. So first point, we have to take a view of a digital transformation or ERP project from business case to business benefit. too often these projects default to a technology project, which is all about the implementation. And that's not particularly helpful. It's the platform that we're putting in place. So let's then start to unpack these 5 points of failure. And I do, at the risk of being slightly provocative, I do hold the executive to account for ensuring that we don't get caught up in these pitfalls. Let's start with the first one: misaligned expectations. Too often that's the case. Too often we start off on this journey and we do not have a common understanding and common alignment amongst all key stakeholders as we're trying to achieve. Interpretations and expectation between and the key business owners who will be responsible for leveraging and utilizing the system. We often have a technology approach from the IT function, and an expectation of very often immediate benefits post-go-live, not even having to go through this period of stabilization and improved user adoption support before we get some indication that those benefits are starting to occur. So if one looks at the different stakeholder groups, even beyond the executive, I think one first needs to ensure that the executive understand why we're doing this. And in my view, there's no good reason to do an ERP or digital transformation project without improving business performance, without contributing to improve business performance, whether that's bringing about new business capabilities or operational excellence or cost efficiencies, regulatory compliance, real-time visibility of information, whatever the case may be. We do need to ensure that as a unit, that executive understands where we're going with this, and how we will measure success. So what constitutes success? What are the key criteria? And my colleague Dom spoke a little bit about that in the previous session. But what are those key metrics that will inform success? And probably equally important, what are the key metrics that will inform failure? How do we know when we're on that low road? How do we know that when we're starting to take a dip on that low road? How will we track those metrics? But when you have differing expectations, that kind of permeates throughout the organization, because it's often the corridor talk that informs what the rest of the organization believes about this project, and the consistency of the message that's being communicated as to what is that pot of gold, what are we trying to achieve over here. And of course, then you throw the SI into the mix, the systems integrator, the solution provider, perhaps some other third-party integration or vendors or other institutions ecosystem partners you may do business with, and you have a very diverse group of stakeholders who want something different out of this project. Of course, there's a high dependency on the SI depending on how one structures the delivery model. And if that contract is set up all around go live, all around implementation, with little or no accountability for driving out improved business performance, then you already have a very different expectation and agenda from a critical party in terms of the broader stakeholder group. So the executive really has to be the glue that holds those expectations together, that ensures that there's a well-defined and consistent message throughout as to what it is we're after. And of course that doesn't just that's not just relevant at the start of the ERP life cycle. When we, as an example, get into the design phase, or understanding what the current pain points are and how we will address that in the 2B design, or what new capabilities will be launched in order to drive improved revenue, we need to continue to reinforce those messages, because with the best will in the world, the project is going to default back to a technology project, because that is frankly just the industry that we operate in, and that is our SI contracts or scope. They do not define the expected business benefits. They define the technologies to be deployed, and everything and all reports and the narrative on the project is from a technology perspective rather than from an improved business benefit perspective. So let me just perhaps pause there after point one, Carla, and perhaps if there are, I can't see the questions at this point, but perhaps there are a few questions that we need to respond to.
Yes. So just a reminder, you can pop your questions in any chat that you are actually joining in via the comments. So we have a great question here from one of our LinkedIn viewers. That's how much time and effort do you invest in getting buy-in from senior management and engagement in an organization? And when do you maybe realize that that's not going to happen? So maybe not an executive piece, but understanding how you get that executive alignment and buy-in.
Yes, I think it's a great question, especially the second part of the question as to at what point does one start to understand that that's not going to happen, and then of course what does one do, um, depending on which role you're in terms of the broader program structure. But let me go to the first question first. I think if there needs to be some type of organizational readiness now whether you independent party doing such an assessment, call it a health check if you want, as to whether the organization as a whole is ready to proceed on this journey, or that's whether that's done by the executive themselves internally, or the chair of the steering committee, or the CEO, whatever the case may be. I do think it needs to be a formal assessment. It perhaps doesn't have to be a real deep dive and take too much time and effort, but at least the question has to be asked. One has to test that with the relevant executive stakeholders as to whether we are aligned as to what we're wanting to achieve. And certainly from my perspective, Carla, I think what we call an executive boot camp, I cannot think of any ERP project focusing on any aspect of it where we do not start with an executive boot camp. It is so important, irrespective of what the role one is doing as third stage honor and engagement of this nature. It is absolutely fundamentally important that we just check where are things at, because if there are very divergent views, or there are people who want this and people who don't want this sitting on the executive, with organizational dynamics, it does disrupt that balance, the dynamic within the organization, commonly called company politics. But absolutely, it does change that dynamic, and it impacts different executives in different ways, some favorably, some less favorably. Sometimes it's a threat, sometimes it's a great platform to move forward on. So I think having some type of formal assessment up front, very important. Doesn't have to be a long, in-depth process, but at least some type of facilitated workshop where we test the strength of the alignment and understanding. And then I think secondly, what does one do when you realize it's not there? Well, in my view, if we cannot get to that point, one has to consider, do we pause the project? Mm-hmm. Do we pause the project and unpack what are the underlying issues that are inhibiting the desired level of alignment? Because the end result is that one is going to go live and you're going to have differing views, and there's nothing worse than being at it for 2 or 3 years, spending tens of, and then getting to a point at the end where the executive have differing views on whether success has been achieved or not, and are interpreting it differently. There's nothing worse than that. So I think one has to consider, do we pause the project at this time and get the relevant stakeholders in a room and try and thrash this out?
Absolutely. That's so important. Just that overall awareness around the reality of that conversation, and building on that, Clifford. Mark on LinkedIn had a comment and a question. So he said, executives have so many demands on their time and attention, but so often ERP failures are due to lack of executive engagement. Is it feasible for them to delegate accountability if they don't realistically feel able or qualified to lead an ERP project?
So my response to, because one hears this often, one hears it from end users when they need to test, business process owners when they need to be involved in design and sign it off, from executives when they need to sit in on steering committees and provide the necessary guidance and oversight. One hears often that, we're busy, we don't have time for a project. And my response is, surely in this day and age of rapid disruption and digital transformation, one of the primary, if not the primary role of the executive is to drive change, is to lead change. And one could even say to be a disrupting force within the executive layer of the organization, surely it's not to maintain the status quo and do tomorrow as we've done yesterday. I mean, that's a path to failure, surely. It's a path to losing market share. One has to be able to continuously innovate and drive change. And that's what digital transformation is. It's we get caught up on the word digital, but it's about transformation. And as depicted on that high road and low road, that transformation is disruptive. And it needs the executive guidance, but it hopefully takes you to a better place where you are able to continue staying relevant in the market, able to launch new products and services, deploy them in new ways, connect with new customers in different ways, etc., etc. So, to cut a long story short, I think it's a primary responsibility of an executive to guide and drive such change rather than to adopt a view that this is in addition to my day job.
Great answers, definitely, Clifford. And keep those questions coming when it comes to this very complicated subject and complex around executive alignment or failure points in a digital transformation. So let's keep going as well. And we did have someone ask for a brief summary about what is executive alignment as well. So maybe we'll layer that in when it comes to your additional content.
Sure, absolutely. Let's. I think we're about halfway through the session, so let's move on to the second key point of failure: outsourcing accountability. And when I talk about accountability, outsourcing accountability for the success of the project, and of course that can never be. One can never outsource accountability, and even if you could, it doesn't really make any sense, because at the end of the day, the client organization has to deal with the impact of failure. It doesn't matter. It's not particularly useful to have had a contract with the SI where you've held them 100% to account for the success of your program, however you define that. You are still going to sit with the negative or adverse impact of a failed program. And the fact that you may be able to invoke some penalties is not particularly useful. So I think too often we chase this in contract negotiation with SIs, with solution providers. Absolutely, one needs somewhat of a balance between, the different roles and responsibilities of the SI, of the solution provider, of all the different keys of the IT function, of the business end users, the executive, all the different stakeholder groups. But accountability can only be with the executive. And what one does see, and certainly what I see in practice, is that where we have a delivery model, by delivery model, I mean the organizational structure, roles, responsibilities, how we set that up in terms of who does what amongst those 4 or 5 key stakeholder groups that I mentioned. When one sees significant involvement and ownership from not even from the client project team, not even from the client IT department, but from the business end users, we have a much higher degree of success. We have it then becomes a model where one is co-creating the solution. There's a common design. There's ample opportunity for the business to understand their current pain points and explore what are opportunities to remediate and address those. There's significant involvement from the end user community in terms of data cleansing and validation, in terms of testing, change management, training, and even to the extent of when one designs the post-go-live support organization, that we have the super user concept as the first level of support sitting within the business. And then that helps us ensure that we follow that high road, and that valley of despair is not too painful, and we don't linger too long in that particular area of the project life cycle. And the path to benefits is certainly a lot quicker. So how we set up the accountability and who we hold accountable is fundamentally important. And one sees, even with large multinational enterprises, there's this expectation that accountability for the success, everyone wants to define that, and it's certainly never defined within an SI contract. And if it is, it's defined as go live, or delivering the last module, ERP module or solution or application system. Certainly never defined as positively impacting on business performance or launching new business capabilities. So one needs to ensure that all key parties, and particularly executive, understand that they are accountable for the success and that there's a common and well-defined understanding of what constitutes success and the type of metrics we will use that will be used to inform that success. And perhaps the last point I want to make on that, Carla, is that it's so important as to, we talk about, there's a common kind of a narrative, this whole area, area of ROI and success, and Eric spoke at length about it. But it's also important as to when the timing of assessing success. It doesn't help that we assess it 3 days, 3 weeks, even 3 months after go live. We're still in that valley of despair. We're still in that stabilization period. So the timing of when we assess the success of the program is extremely important. We must allow for ourselves to go through that stabilization period, but at the same time be able to track and provide relevant feedback on how quickly we're actually coming out of that. So setting the program up front with accountability firmly on the side of the executive and on the side of the business executive is extremely important.
Clifford is always the best at describing things in a very simplistic way that's easy to digest and just really honestly fun to say. So when you talk about the valley of despair, Clifford, how do you know that you're in the valley of despair? Because a digital transformation can be really difficult. And I agree with this question. How do you know that you're there and it's not just kind of a tough situation? What are some key indicators?
Yes. It's a very relevant question. And I think to anyone who's been an ERP project manager, within a couple of days after deployment or go live, you're going to know, because you're not going to be able to walk out of your office down the passage with people telling you we're in the valley of despair. They may define and articulate it in more colorful language often, but there's generally going to be a lot of noise in the system. There's going to be a lot of, I think that's the first thing that's apparent. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of anxiety. Users cannot log on. The authorizations and roles perhaps not properly tested, and that's often an area of contention or area that's problematic immediately post go live. Certain business processes are not going to be able to be executed on the system. The system may not even be available. So do tend to come to the fore at month end. So being able to conduct, and one picks that up quite quickly. And again, I want to emphasize that it is so important that one can provide relevant information back to the key stakeholders as to what is going on the ground. And we need to, and communication becomes so important, Carla, because, and I'll never forget, I had a change manager who once said to me, no message is still a message. And when you're not communicating in that post go live, and it's merely the corridor speak that is becoming the primary voice or primary assessment of the success or otherwise of the program, you're in trouble. So one has to be able to provide clear analytics and statistics on what are the numbers of calls coming in, analyze those calls or help desk tickets. Is it training issues? Is it configuration issues? Is it authorization issues? And how quickly are they being resolved so that you have some control over that noise and emotion that's taking place in the corridors? So perhaps a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's such an important area, because from there on one starts to get a grip on being able to assess and articulate the success or failure of the program. It's no use trying to start to do that. You're immediately on the back foot if you allow that situation to linger for too long and you're not able to get some control over the messaging and the analytics and statistics that are coming out when you're in that valley of despair.
It's such a great answer. And I love how you kind of layered in the communication aspect of that, in the importance of kind of getting control of that narrative. Another question on that valley of despair concept, Ghassan on LinkedIn, who's actually on our CIO panel later this afternoon, talked about the valley of despair can be too deep to get out of. How do you address that if that is a failure point? Is that when you go to a triage or restoration project, or what does that look like? Yes,
it did. I mean, I think that a lot would have needed to have gone wrong in the preceding phases. I mean, specifically in the testing, in the configuration build, the data migration. So, and of course, what this really talks to, it comes back to the previous presentation, Carla, around being able to assess the readiness to go live. And let me then get into that and into that point 3, also in the interest of time, because I think it talks to that premature declaration of victory. That's what leads us into the situation where it's sometimes very difficult to come out of that. But and one needs to understand that whether you are indeed coming out of it or not, because that's where it becomes important to have the analytics to be able to track that the number of calls are starting to reduce, the configuration or data or any other issues are starting to be addressed. We've had refresher training. We're starting to stabilize the business involvement. The user adoption is improving. And one needs to get some key allies on your side at that point in time and start to champion it and remind everybody about what's the pot of gold that we're trying to chase over here in terms of the benefits. And the fact that this is kind of just one pitfall or speed bump in the road to those benefits, and keep the focus on that. So I think being confident that you are able to deploy the solution is so important. And I must take a little bit of a shot at our colleagues in the systems integrator space on this one, because too often we have projects and statements of work and SI contracts that are designed around the achievement of specific milestone, time-driven milestones. So in other words, the project plan is that we're going live on the 1st of January, and come high water, we're going live on the 1st of January because the final invoice payment, the billing schedule aligns to that, is linked to that particular date. And certainly, I'm a great advocate of ensuring that there are quality-driven metrics. There may be time-driven metrics, but they also need to be augmented with quality-driven metrics. So we will be able to go live if we have tested 95% of our critical business processes at least twice. If we have no or less than 0.5% high severity errors and defects in the solution, if we have at least 98% of all our master and transactional data fully converted. One has to set those types of criteria have to have them in place, and have them in place because it's extremely difficult to bring that in halfway down on the journey. It's kind of like trying to fix the Boeing in flight, and you're not going to necessarily get a very good reception from your SR when you suddenly want to change the contract and bring about some additional parameters or constraints from their perspective, some additional to meet their target dates and collect those final invoices. So I do think that our ability to make an informed decision to whether we are ready to go live. And perhaps the last point I'll make on this, just a little bit of a practical story, what one often sees. And I sit in a number of digital transformation steering committees, and you're in trouble when you walk into the steering committee, the final steering committee, that is to make the decision on whether one's ready to go live or not. And one or two scenarios plays out. The SI walks in, and we have the whole executive sitting there. The SI walks in and says, we're ready to go live. And everybody looks at their shoes, and it gets a little bit awkward. And within 5 minutes, the decision, by default, because no one has questioned it, the decision's made and you go live, and that normally doesn't end well. The other end of the spectrum is where one has the final steering committee to make the decision to go live, and it's a whole day debate and discussion amongst the executive and the other key stakeholders as to our readiness to go live. And that's generally because we don't have a good understanding of what the indicators and metrics are, and there's not sufficient evidence presented to support a conclusion as to whether we've achieved those metrics or not. So neither of those scenarios are healthy, but one does encounter that quite often. And therefore, again, come back to the point that it's so important that we set those metrics up front, that we understand who needs to achieve them, and that it's an informed decision with adequate evidence as to the readiness to go live. Let me pause there as well and just see if there are any follow-up questions or comments, Carla.
Yes, we've got some great questions here. So this is a little bit outside of this specific key point, but it's one of your expertise, Clifford. So I wanted to just jump in and ask you. So Mark on LinkedIn asks, how do you think that SIs are at least motivated by maintaining their reputations? So that's more powerful in holding them accountable in the contract terms and deliverables. So I know you're going to go into this a lot in your quality assurance Q&A later this afternoon, but I thought I might kind of just put this out there so that you can have a chance to address that.
Yes, I'll try and address it, very succinctly. So absolutely, and many clients do, they do rely on the reputation or the fact that there could be some reputational damage for the SI if things don't go well. But that is assuming that you are able to demonstrate that they were at fault. And certainly on a standard SI agreement, you're going to struggle. They do cover themselves. So I mean, there are many projects that don't go well, and as I know that Eric would be able to attest to, hence him spending a lot of time in legal suits on this topic, that it's very difficult to prove that, because certainly the contract's not going to be structured in a manner that allows you to easily. Let me give you one example. A general clause in an SI contract is that after integration testing, we have user acceptance testing, and that is a handover point. And you then, as the client, take on accountability and responsibility for the success of the deployment or for the completeness of the solution that has been handed over to you by the SI for user acceptance testing. And your right of recourse is significantly limited post that point. Now, that will be in the fine print in the contract. Many clients would not understand that and would not organize themselves adequately to ensure a comprehensive and robust user acceptance testing, or that they put down certain predefined, a threshold or predefined metrics upon which, and only upon which, they will take control of the solution, upon the achievement of those metrics by the SI. So I think the first thing is, that's all well and fine. One can rely on the reputation, but you have to then demonstrate and prove that the SI was at fault. You're going to struggle to do that on a standard SI contract. And I think secondly, one also mustn't discount the importance of collecting the final invoice and ensuring that the engagement is profitable, because that's going to be the trade-off often. Do we go live and ensure that we don't incur any additional expenses from an SI perspective, and ensure that we collect the revenue that was forecasted for this engagement, and do we do that at the risk of the solution not quite being ready, but us not, as an SI, not being willing to incur any additional cost to delay the project. So it's often those type of trade-offs that you're asking senior partners and directors to make on the side of the SI, and sad to say, often it's the money that wins, that takes preference, I'm afraid.
Well, I think that's a really important subject. And I know you're going to go into it a bit more this afternoon. And just a reminder that if you can't join this afternoon live, no worries. We will send out a recording of all of these different sessions. David has a really good question on LinkedIn, but I'm going to save it because it has to do with the user adoption process. So why don't you go into that point, Clifford, and then we'll go ahead and address that in just a second.
Sure. I think I only have a few. I think I'm over already, am I not, Carla?
That's okay. We have about a 15-minute buffer, so we definitely want to make sure we get to everyone's questions, and then we'll go into software selection in just a few minutes.
Fantastic. Let me try and get through those last 2 points. So the fourth point is really around that very issue of low levels of business adoption, and perhaps just a little story that might demonstrate this in terms of my experience. Over the years, I've had a number of CIOs who often do head up these projects, or to whom these projects often do report, come to me and say, we've been live for 2, 3, 5, 6 months, whatever the case may be, and my CEO keeps asking me where the benefits are and whether this project's been successful, and what's actually been achieved out of the project, what benefits have been achieved. And my is, why is he asking you? Yeah, you as the head of IT. Why is he not asking the business executives, the head of finance, supply chain, procurement, marketing, etc.? Because that's where the accountability should sit. And too often, finger pointing, to have that when you have that misexpectations up front, one gets into this finger pointing, and we do need to be able to measure the level of user adoption. In the worst cases, if I back on some of my experiences, in the worst cases, we spend all that time and effort implementing months off to go live. ERP, people have defaulted to Excel, and or 15, 20, 30% of users have not even logged on yet. So one has to then ask the question that how are you doing your job if you manage to circumvent the ERP system, through which maybe 80, 90% of your business transactions. How do you actually perform your role then if you had on after X number of. So I think it's really important if I'm the program manager of IT, one wants to ensure that ownership sits in the right area, find and understand, and that one is able to monitor the level to which the new solution is being utilized and leveraged in pursuit of those business benefits. And if you're not able to do that, I'm afraid, as the head of IT or manager, you're going to draw a lot of attention. It's sometimes convenient for business to keep this as an IT project. Be quite forceful in each. So let me move on to the next point, and we'll see if we still have time for one or two quick questions. So unhosted benefits. I think what in practice what happens of the projects is we kind of go through that valley of despair. We come out at the projects overrun. It's over cost, over time, over budget, and the organization is just happy to go live and just happy to at least see some signs of light as we exit this valley of despair. That we always run success throughout the course of this journey, and it defaults once again to a technology project. So being able to ensure that aspirations around those benefits, and indeed to build the capabilities within the organization to be able to define, monitor, track, and articulate and harvest those benefits is extremely important. It is a competency that we need to establish that is often within, and it is to ensure it is there, and that continue to hold the right people accountable. Because the bottom line is the IT department processes, they don't control the competency of the individual or business end users. Certainly they manage the underlying infrastructure and they provide technical support. But by far, the levers for success sit on the business side, and the ability of an IT department or project management team to positively influence those levers are limited in comparison to the business owners. Therefore, I think it's so important that that accountability sits within your executive, and that they are the ones who are asked the question as to why the benefits have not been achieved. I'll stop there, Carla. That's the end of my talk. If we do have time for one or two last questions, very happy to take those.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, David had a great question on LinkedIn that I definitely want to get to, a comment and question. He said, in my experience in general, is that it is very hard to get commitments and resources from the operating part of the organization. The top level management can be very supportive, but lower down you get all kinds of excuses. What is the most important tool in order to get focus and resources from these operatives?
Sure. in short, I think it comes down to governance, and it comes down to what, having some type of decision-making process in place, some type of RACI model if you want, and that needs to be defined and agreed and understood upfront, not just defined on paper, but it actually needs to be very clearly communicated and accepted by the operations, as he put it, operating side of the business. And really what I'm saying over here, who is required to make decisions on what, based on what criteria? Because if as an operating business, or as what I call the business community, you are saying to me as the project team, I'm happy for you to make a decision as to whether the to-be design reflects our ambition and aspirations going forward, or I'm happy for you as the project team to make the final decision about whether the solution has been configured and built in accordance with the design, or I'm happy for you to make the decision. The business community is ready, the solution is ready to be deployed within the business community, and they've been competency levels are at the required level. Then fine, but let's get that up front and let's understand who is going to make what decisions and why they need, because only the business can make the decision about whether the solution complies or conforms with the design as they've articulated it to the project team. So I think one has to get that sorted right up front and ensure that those decisions are then made at the critical intervals in the project, and that we remove any possibility or opportunity for certain stakeholder groups to say we were not involved, or we didn't understand, or it wasn't our decision, it was your decision. I think one has to be quite aggressive and firm on that front.
And how would you do that, Clifford, if you're in a larger, maybe global, very complex organization? What are some tactics that you can do to kind of scale that governance to ensure that it hits all pieces of the business?
Yes, once again, Carla, I think one has to be unfortunately quite detailed and specific in those in these areas, to the extent of we understand, in terms of how we structure it, to the extent of we understand what is the functional footprint or scope that this new solution is going to touch, in terms of which part of the business is going to touch, who are the heads of department, or what we typically call the business process owners, who are the individuals that are accountable for these particular areas. An organizational impact assessment, which I've no doubt my colleague Donia will touch on later on, in terms of how are things changing, and ensuring that along each step of the way, Dom spoke about a stage gate process, each step of the way we design, and we're very deliberate and formal about this, we design that decision-making process so that there's ample opportunity for these. It's not just opportunity; it's a requirement that we have the right people making these decisions, doing an assessment and making decisions as to whether the project can proceed, whether those deliverables have been and goals have been met. And the business community's role has to be very well defined, and there needs to be a formal approval and sign off of those deliverables before we proceed to the next stage. So we don't come out of design and proceed to the build phase. And these are, of course, very structured phases with very defined deliverables, following a very industry accepted implementation methodology. Activate, in the case of SAP, is the relevant methodology. It's a very structured process, and we do not proceed to the next phase of the project until those deliverables have been formally signed off by the right individuals. So one has to be extremely deliberate and detailed about this, and be willing to say that we're not happy to proceed because we do not have acceptance by the relevant business stakeholders that this is the design that they're wanting us to build. It's really that simple.
Absolutely. Such great insight. Now, I'll end with one final question, if that works with you, Clifford. And again, if you're just tuning in, you can watch all of the replays here. But we have Jordan on LinkedIn that said a major part of a digital transformation can be characterized as enabling companies to derive business value from the integration of technology capabilities. Do you think that optimizing the process of generating qualitative information from quantitative data is key to optimizing business processes, leading to a successful business management strategy. So overall, talking about the optimization of data and processes in a digital transformation.
Fundamentally important, and Carla, because and it talks to why are we doing this. If we are merely doing this as undertaking a digital transformation as a technology refresh, and in that case I wouldn't call it a digital transformation because you're not transforming anything. But if that is the case, then perhaps then we need to acknowledge and recognize that up front, that we're not going to be doing very much business process reengineering. So it aligns. So our approach to business processes needs to be informed by the reasons for undertaking the project. And on the other hand, and I would suggest that that's never a good reason. There's never a good reason to take, in this case, I'm talking about ERP, to undertake an ERP result or improve performance, however we find that. So there are missed opportunities if a technology refresh. There should always be some type of business process reengineering. Absolutely, one needs to be able to track that. And these days, all the major, certainly the tier one ERP solutions, have the tools to be able to do business process modeling, business process monitoring, tracking, and driving, and monitor and measure and drive improvement. So there's no real excuse for not having that as part of your objective. And things like an organizational impact assessment will help you understand where the changes are in terms of new roles, new improved processes, the extent to which current pain points are addressed, etc., etc. So I think it's, number one, it's extremely important that we are able to demonstrate that improvement, define it and track it, and certainly all the tools are there to be able to do that. The last point I'd make on that, we sometimes get into trouble when we sign an SI contract which has a very short blueprinting phase or is merely a template rollout, which does not allow sufficient time and effort to be able to unpack current pain points and design solutions to address them. And it's kind of, very much an adopt rather than adapt process, i.e. adopt our template rather than adapt your business processes in pursuit of better practice.
Very well said. And I know you're going to dive into kind of that vendor relationship and quality assurance in our Q&A later today. So thank you so much, Clifford, for all of the great insight. And thank you to our audience for the amazing questions. Please keep them coming.